When Thomas opened his door to a giant mare and 3 skeletal foals collapsing in the blizzard, he thought he understood the full horror of their suffering. Then the mare fell to his living room floor, and he saw what she had been shielding beneath her massive body, a 4th foal, pure white and barely breathing, that had been invisible against the snow. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen plains, carrying with it sheets of snow so thick that the world beyond Thomas Brennan's farmhouse had disappeared entirely. It was the kind of blizzard that the old-timers talked about with reverence and fear, the kind that could bury a man's entire herd overnight and leave nothing but white silence in the morning. Thomas stood at his kitchen window, a cup of cooling coffee forgotten in his weathered hands, watching the storm rage with an intensity he hadn't seen in his 68 years of living on this unforgiving land. The thermometer outside read 15 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder, cold enough to steal the breath from your lungs and freeze the moisture in your eyes before you could blink it away. Thomas had lived alone on this small farm for the past 7 years, ever since his wife Margaret had passed quietly in her sleep one autumn morning. Their children had long since moved to the cities, chasing dreams and opportunities that the harsh rural life could never provide. They called sometimes, worried about their aging father weathering these brutal winters alone, but Thomas always assured them he was fine. The truth was more complicated. He was lonely, yes, but he was also at peace in a way that only those who have lived close to the land can understand. His days followed a simple rhythm, caring for his small herd of cattle, maintaining the property, and in the evenings, sitting by the fireplace with his old dog Winston, reading or simply watching the flames dance in the hearth. But tonight was different. Tonight the storm had transformed his familiar world into an alien landscape of white fury. He had brought the cattle into the barn hours ago, making sure they had enough hay and water to last through the night. Winston lay by the fire, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, occasionally lifting his head to listen to the wind's assault on the old farmhouse. The dog was 14 now, moving slowly and sleeping more than he used to, but his ears were still sharp, and Thomas had learned over the years to trust Winston's instincts about things that his own aging senses might miss. It was just past 9 in the evening, when Winston's head shot up suddenly, his ears alert and pointing toward the front of the house. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive but warning, the kind of sound he made when something unexpected was approaching. Thomas set down his coffee cup and moved toward the window, peering out into the swirling whiteness. At first he saw nothing but snow and darkness, the porch light barely penetrating a few feet into the storm. Then, like ghosts materializing from the blizzard, he saw them horses. 4 of them, moving slowly through the deep snow toward his house. But these weren't ordinary horses. Even through the storm, Thomas could see that the lead mare was enormous, larger than any horse he'd seen in his decades of farming. Her coat was a pale gray, almost white, making her blend with the snow except for her massive dark eyes that seemed to glow in the porch light behind her. Stumbling and struggling through the drifts were 3 foals, so thin that their ribs showed even through their shaggy winter coats. They moved with the desperation of creatures on the edge of survival, and the mare kept turning her great head back to check on them, urging them forward with soft whinnies that Thomas could barely hear over the wind. He stood frozen at the window, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Wild horses weren't common in this area anymore, and domestic horses didn't just appear in the middle of a blizzard. Where had they come from? How had they survived in this weather? And why were they here at his door as if they knew this was a place of refuge? The foals looked to be only a few months old, far too young to be exposed to such brutal conditions. Their legs trembled with exhaustion and cold as they followed their mother through the snow, each step a monumental effort. The mare reached the porch steps and stopped, her massive head turning to look directly at the window where Thomas stood. For a moment their eyes met through the glass, and Thomas felt something pass between them, a plea so desperate and profound that it needed no words. She took another step forward and then, incredibly, she pawed at his door. Once, twice, 3 times, the sound of her hoof against the wood cutting through the howl of the wind. It was a knock, as deliberate as any human visitor might make, a request for entry that was impossible to ignore. Winston had risen to his feet now, moving toward the door with his tail wagging tentatively, his initial warning growl replaced by curious whines. Thomas felt his heart pounding in his chest as he moved toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. Every practical part of his brain told him this was impossible, that horses didn't knock on doors, that there had to be some explanation he wasn't seeing. But his instincts, honed by a lifetime of working with animals, told him something different. These creatures needed help desperately, and somehow they had found their way to him. He opened the door, and the full force of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow. The mare stood on his porch, snow covering her back and mane, her breath coming in great clouds of steam in the frozen air. Up close, she was even more impressive, standing at least 18 hands high, her presence both magnificent and heartbreaking. Behind her, the 3 foals huddled together, their small bodies shaking uncontrollably. Thomas could see now that they weren't just thin, they were starving, their coats dull and patchy, their eyes hollow with hunger and exhaustion. Thomas stood there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, his mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities alike. The practical farmer in him knew that horses, even desperate ones, didn't simply appear at your door in the middle of a blizzard and ask for help. Yet here they were, and the evidence of their suffering was undeniable. The mare took a step closer, and Thomas instinctively stepped back, not from fear, but from sheer awe at her size. She was gentle despite her massive frame, moving with a careful deliberation that spoke of intelligence and awareness. She lowered her great head and then did something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. She looked back at her foals, then at him, then at the open doorway behind him, and then back to her foals again. The message was unmistakable. She wanted him to help her babies. "Come on, then," Thomas heard himself saying, his voice rough with emotion. The wind nearly stole his words, but the mare seemed to understand. She turned and nudged the first foal forward with her nose, a gentle but insistent push that got the trembling creature moving toward the door. Thomas stepped aside, and the little one stumbled into his entryway, its legs barely able to support its weight. The second foal followed, then the third, each one looking more fragile than the last. They stood in his hallway, dripping melted snow onto the worn wooden floors, their sides heaving with exhaustion. Winston approached them cautiously, sniffing each one with his tail still wagging, his gentle nature recognizing their vulnerability. The mare remained on the porch, and for a moment, Thomas thought she would leave now that her foals were safe. But she didn't move. She stood there looking at him with those impossibly dark eyes, and Thomas understood. She was waiting for permission, waiting to be invited in as well. It was absurd, inviting a horse the size of a small truck into his house, but everything about this night had crossed the border into the surreal. He stepped back further and gestured toward the door. "Come on, girl, you too. You've earned it." The mare ducked her massive head and stepped carefully through the doorway, her hooves clicking on the hardwood floor. She had to turn slightly to fit her broad shoulders through the frame, but she managed it with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Thomas closed the door behind her, shutting out the howling wind and driving snow. The sudden silence was almost deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the living room and the heavy breathing of the 4 horses now standing in his hallway. He looked at them, really looked at them, and felt his heart break a little more. The foals were in terrible shape. Their ribs protruded sharply under their dull coats, and their legs were so thin they looked like they might snap under the slightest pressure. Their eyes were sunken, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that spoke of days, maybe weeks, of suffering. The mare was in better condition, relatively speaking, but even she showed signs of prolonged hunger. Her hip bones jutted out prominently, and there were patches where her coat had been rubbed raw, possibly from pushing through brush or fencing. He needed to act quickly. Hypothermia and starvation were both immediate threats. Thomas moved toward the kitchen, his mind already cataloging what supplies he had on hand. Winston followed him, leaving the horses standing uncertainly in the hallway. The mare watched him go, then carefully lowered herself to the floor with a soft groan, her foals immediately pressing against her for warmth. It was a sign of just how exhausted she was that she would lie down in this strange environment, but Thomas recognized it as trust too. She had brought her babies to him, and now she was giving herself permission to rest, believing somehow that they were safe. In the kitchen, Thomas pulled out everything he could think of that might help. He had some grain for his cattle, and while it wasn't ideal for horses, it would provide calories and warmth. He grabbed several old blankets from the linen closet, thick wool ones that Margaret had collected over the years. He filled a large pot with warm water, not too hot, just enough to take the chill off horses needed to warm up gradually. He knew that much. Too much heat too fast could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He carried everything back to the hallway, where the 4 horses remained exactly as he'd left them. The mare lifted her head as he approached, and Thomas knelt down beside the nearest foal, a little gray one with a white star on its forehead. "Easy now, little one," he murmured, wrapping one of the blankets around its shivering body. The foal didn't resist, too weak and cold to do anything, but accept the warmth. He covered each of the foals in turn, tucking the blankets around them as gently as he could. They weighed almost nothing, he realized with alarm. These babies should have been robust and playful, full of the energy that young things possess. Instead, they were hollow shells, barely clinging to life. Thomas brought the pot of warm water and set it down carefully in front of the foals. They looked at it with dull interest but seemed too exhausted to move. He dipped his hand in the water and brought it to the nose of the nearest foal, letting a few drops fall onto its muzzle. The little one's tongue came out automatically, licking at the moisture, and then suddenly its survival instinct kicked in. It lowered its head to the pot and began drinking. Small sips at first, then longer draws. The other 2 foals followed suit, crowding around the water with a desperation that was painful to witness. Thomas had to pull the pot away after a few minutes, knowing that too much water too quickly could make them sick. They protested weakly, but he was firm. More in a little while, he promised them softly. The mare had been watching this entire process with intense focus, her ears forward and her eyes tracking every movement Thomas made with her foals. Now she lifted her head higher and made a soft, nickering sound, almost questioning. Thomas met her gaze and saw something there that made him pause. It wasn't just concern for her babies. There was something else, something deeper and more urgent in those dark eyes. She struggled to her feet, a process that took longer than it should have for a horse her size and strength. Once standing, she moved past Thomas toward the living room, where the fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls. She stopped at the doorway and looked back at him, then forward again, then back once more. It was the same gesture she had made on the porch, that deliberate communication that transcended species. "You want me to follow you," Thomas said, though it wasn't really a question. He stood and walked toward her, Winston trotting along beside him with curious interest. The mare moved into the living room and walked directly to the fireplace, the warmest spot in the house. But she didn't stop there. Instead, she positioned herself in front of the fire and then, with visible effort, lowered herself to the ground again. As she did, Thomas saw something that made him gasp aloud. Between her hind legs, pressed against her belly, and hidden until now by her sheer size and the poor lighting of the hallway, was a fourth foal, but this one wasn't gray like the others. This one was pure white, smaller than its siblings, and completely still. "Oh God," Thomas breathed, dropping to his knees beside the tiny creature. At first he thought it was dead. Its eyes were closed and it lay motionless against its mother's warm belly. But when he placed his hand gently on its side, he felt the faintest flutter of breath, irregular and weak, but there nonetheless. This baby was alive, barely, hanging on to life by the thinnest of threads. It was so much smaller than the other foals, possibly a runt or perhaps born premature. Its white coat was thin and patchy, offering almost no protection from the cold, and its little body felt like ice despite being pressed against the mare's warmth. Thomas understood now with perfect clarity why the mare had been so insistent, why she had knocked on his door in the middle of a blizzard. She hadn't just been seeking shelter for herself and the 3 foals he could see. She had been trying to save this tiny one, this fragile scrap of life that would surely die without immediate help. The mare turned her massive head and touched her nose to the white foal, a gesture so tender and filled with love that Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. She whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry all the desperation and hope of a mother fighting for her child's life. Then she looked at Thomas, and in that moment he felt the full weight of her trust settle on his shoulders. She had traveled through a deadly blizzard, starving and exhausted, protecting 4 babies when she could barely protect herself, all to bring them to this place, to this man, because somehow she knew or hoped or prayed that he could help them. How she had found his farm in the storm, how she had known to come here. These were questions that Thomas knew would never have answers. Some things existed beyond explanation, beyond logic, in that realm where desperation and faith intersect. He moved quickly now, his hand steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. This foal needed warmth immediately, the kind of warmth that blankets and fireplaces alone couldn't provide. He had seen newborn calves in similar condition, and he knew what had to be done. Thomas went to the bathroom and started filling the tub with warm water, testing the temperature carefully with his elbow, the way Margaret used to test bath water for their babies all those years ago. Not too hot, just warm enough to gradually raise the foal's body temperature without shocking its system. While the tub filled, he grabbed more towels and brought them to the living room. The mare watched with intense anxiety as Thomas gently lifted the white foal from where it lay against her belly. The little one weighed almost nothing in his arms, lighter than a bag of feed, its body limp and unresponsive. The mare struggled to rise, clearly wanting to follow, but Thomas spoke to her in a low, soothing voice. "It's okay, Mama. I'm going to help your baby, trust me." Whether she understood his words or simply the tone of his voice, the mare settled back down, though her eyes never left the tiny white bundle in his arms. Thomas carried the foal carefully to the bathroom, supporting its head and keeping it cradled against his chest, trying to share what little warmth his own body could provide. In the bathroom, he lowered the foal slowly into the warm water, keeping its head above the surface. At first there was no reaction at all, and Thomas's heart seized with fear that he was already too late. But then, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, the foal's eyelids fluttered. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but it was life. Thomas felt relief wash over him so powerfully that he had to blink back tears. He kept one hand under the foal's head and used the other to gently pour water over its body, letting the warmth seep into its cold muscles and frozen joints. The foal's breathing remained shallow and irregular, but it was breathing, and that was what mattered. Winston had followed them into the bathroom and now sat by the tub, his gray muzzle resting on the edge, watching the proceedings with worried eyes. The old dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining perfectly still and quiet, offering his silent support. Thomas spoke softly as he worked, a steady stream of encouragement and comfort directed at the tiny foal. "Come on, little one. Stay with us. You're safe now. You're going to be okay." He didn't know if the words were more for the foal or for himself, but they helped steady his nerves and keep his hands from shaking as he continued the warming process. After about 20 minutes in the water, the foal began to show more signs of life. Its eyes opened fully for the first time, revealing irises of the deepest brown, almost black. They were unfocused at first, confused and frightened. But as the foal became more aware of its surroundings, Thomas saw a spark of alertness kindle in those dark depths. The little one tried to lift its head higher, a weak attempt, but an attempt nonetheless. "Good, that's good," Thomas murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a fighter, aren't you? Just like your mama." He could see now that this wasn't just any foal. There was something special about this little white creature. Something that went beyond its unusual coloring or small size. It had survived when it should have died, protected by a mother who refused to give up, and now it was fighting its way back from the edge of death with a determination that belied its fragile appearance. When Thomas felt that the foal's body temperature had risen enough, he carefully lifted it from the water and wrapped it in thick, warm towels. He rubbed gently, drying the thin white coat and stimulating circulation, being careful around the delicate legs and tiny hooves. The foal made soft sounds now, weak whinnies, that nonetheless carried a note of protest at being handled so much. Thomas smiled at the sound. "That's it, little fighter. Get mad. Getting mad means you're feeling better." He carried the foal back to the living room, where the mare immediately lifted her head and nickered anxiously. When she saw her baby moving and making sounds, relief flooded her expression in a way that was purely, unmistakably maternal. Thomas lowered the white foal back down next to its mother, and the mare immediately began nuzzling it, licking its face and ears with her large tongue, checking every inch of her baby with a thoroughness that spoke of desperate love. The foal, now warmer and slightly more alert, pressed against its mother's side and began searching instinctively for milk. Thomas held his breath as the little one latched on and began to nurse. It was a weak attempt, the foal's suckling reflex barely functioning, but it was there. The mare stood perfectly still, barely breathing herself, giving her baby every chance to feed. After what seemed like only a few seconds, the white foal's energy gave out, and it slumped against its mother's leg. Exhausted by even that small effort, Thomas knew this was far from over. The foal had survived the immediate crisis of hypothermia, but it was still desperately weak and malnourished. All four foals were, in fact, though the white one was by far the worst off. And then there was the mare herself, who had been starving herself to provide milk for her babies, burning through her own body's reserves to keep them alive. Thomas went to the kitchen and prepared a mixture of warm water, molasses, and a little grain, creating a mash that would be easy for the foals to digest and would provide quick energy. He brought it out in 4 separate bowls, setting one in front of each foal. The 3 gray foals, though weak, managed to eat small amounts of the mash, their hunger overcoming their exhaustion. Thomas had to be careful not to let them eat too much too quickly, as he knew their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle large amounts of food after prolonged starvation. He rationed their portions carefully, giving them just enough to provide some nourishment without making them sick. The white foal, however, couldn't manage the mash at all. It was simply too weak to lift its head for more than a few seconds at a time. Thomas tried hand-feeding it, bringing tiny amounts to its mouth on his fingers, but the little one could barely swallow. This baby would need something more, something specifically designed for its fragile condition. He remembered that he had some powdered colostrum supplement in the barn, left over from last spring when one of his cows had rejected her calf colostrum. Was nature's perfect first food, packed with antibodies and nutrients specifically designed for newborns. If he could get some into the white foal, it might provide the boost the little one needed to start recovering. The problem was that the barn was a good 100 feet from the house, and the blizzard was still raging outside with undiminished fury. But Thomas knew he didn't have a choice. This foal wouldn't survive the night without proper nutrition, and the mare's milk alone wasn't enough in her current depleted state. He bundled himself up in his heaviest coat, pulled on his insulated boots, and wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. Before he left, he knelt down beside the mare and looked into her eyes. "I'll be right back," he told her. "I'm going to get something that will help your baby." The mare watched him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Thomas could have sworn she understood every word. She was trusting him with the most precious things in her world, and he was determined not to fail her. Winston whined softly, wanting to follow, but Thomas ordered him to stay. The old dog was too frail for this weather, and someone needed to watch over the horses while he was gone. The moment Thomas opened the door, the wind tried to rip it from his hands. He had to use all his strength to pull it closed behind him, and even then the latch barely caught. The world outside was pure white chaos, snow driving horizontally across the yard with such force that it stung his exposed skin like needles. The cold was so intense it felt like breathing in shards of glass. Thomas couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, and he had to navigate by memory and feel, using the rope he always kept strung between the house and barn for exactly this kind of emergency. He grabbed the rope with both hands and began pulling himself forward, each step a battle against the wind that tried to knock him off his feet. The journey to the barn, which normally took less than a minute, felt like it took hours. By the time Thomas reached the barn door, his hands were numb despite his heavy gloves, and ice had formed on his eyelashes and the scarf covering his face. He fumbled with the latch, his frozen fingers barely able to grip it, but finally managed to wrench the door open and stumble inside. The barn was dark and cold, but at least it was out of the wind. His cattle lowed softly from their stalls, disturbed by his late-night entrance but quickly settling when they recognized his presence. Thomas made his way to the supply closet where he kept veterinary supplies, medical equipment, and various supplements and medications. His hands shook as he searched through the shelves, partly from cold and partly from urgency. Finally, his fingers closed around the container of colostrum supplement. He grabbed it along with some feeding bottles and nipples, stuffing everything into a canvas bag that he slung over his shoulder. The trip back to the house was even worse than the journey out. Now he was walking directly into the wind, and each step forward felt like trying to push through a solid wall. The rope was his lifeline, the only thing keeping him oriented in the whiteout conditions. At one point, a particularly strong gust nearly tore his grip free, and he had to wrap the rope around his wrist to keep from losing contact with it. He thought of the mare and her foals waiting in his house, thought of that tiny white baby fighting for life, and he kept moving. When he finally reached the porch and pulled himself up the steps, his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He yanked the door open and practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind him and leaning against it while he caught his breath. Winston rushed over to him, tail wagging with relief at his return. The horses were exactly where he had left them, the mare's eyes tracking him as he moved further into the house, her body a protective barrier around her 4 foals. Thomas peeled off his frozen outer layers with numb fingers, leaving them in a heap by the door, and carried the canvas bag to the kitchen. His hands were so cold that it took several minutes before he could feel his fingers well enough to work with them. He filled one of the bottles with warm water and mixed in the colostrum powder according to the directions on the container, shaking it vigorously until it was completely dissolved. When he returned to the living room, the white foal was lying completely still against its mother's belly, its sides barely moving with each shallow breath. Thomas knelt down beside it, testing the temperature of the formula against his wrist, the way new parents do with baby bottles. It was just right. Warm, but not hot. He gently lifted the foal's head and brought the nipple to its mouth, squeezing a few drops onto its lips. At first there was no response, and Thomas felt his heart sink. But then the foal's tongue moved, licking at the sweet liquid, and its mouth opened slightly. Thomas eased the nipple in, and miracle of miracles, the foal began to suck. It was a weak, uncoordinated effort at first, with more formula dribbling out than going in, but the foal was trying. Thomas held the bottle steady, murmuring encouragement, his free hand supporting the little one's head. The mare watched intently, her nostrils flaring as she scented the formula, but she made no move to interfere. She seemed to understand that Thomas was helping, that this strange human with his odd contraptions was doing exactly what her baby needed. The foal managed to take perhaps an ounce of formula before its strength gave out completely, and it collapsed back against its mother, exhausted by the effort. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. Thomas sat back on his heels, looking at the scene before him. His living room had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, or perhaps a fever dream. 4 horses lay on his floor, surrounded by blankets and towels, the firelight casting dancing shadows on their bodies. Winston had settled down near the foals, having apparently decided that these strange visitors needed guarding. The 3 gray foals were sleeping now, their breathing steadier than when they had first arrived, though still far from normal. The white foal's eyes had closed again, but there was something different about it now. The deathly stillness had been replaced by the natural sleep of an exhausted baby, and Thomas could see its sides rising and falling in a more regular rhythm. He checked his watch and was startled to see that it was past midnight. The whole ordeal, from the moment the horses had appeared at his door until now, had taken only a few hours, though it felt like days. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind howling around the corners of the house like a living thing. Thomas knew that if these horses had remained outside even one more hour, they would all be dead. The 3 gray foals would have succumbed first, followed by the tiny white one, and eventually even the mighty mare would have fallen, her massive strength finally overcome by cold and starvation. The thought made him shudder. What chain of events had led them here to his door at exactly the right moment? He got up and made himself a cup of strong coffee, needing the warmth and the caffeine. As he stood in his kitchen looking out at the storm through the window above the sink, his mind turned to the questions he had been too busy to ask until now. Where had these horses come from? The mare's size and conformation suggested draft horse breeding, possibly a mix of Percheron and something else, something that gave her that unusual gray coloring and those remarkably intelligent eyes. The foals appeared to be hers, all showing similar characteristics despite their weakened condition. But draft horses didn't just wander around loose, especially not with young foals in tow. Someone owned them, or had owned them. Someone was responsible for the fact that they had been starving, neglected, left to die in a blizzard. Thomas felt anger begin to burn in his chest, hot and righteous. What kind of person could do this to animals? Horses were expensive to keep, yes, but if you couldn't afford them or didn't want them, there were ways to rehome them, rescues that would take them, auctions where they could be sold. You didn't just abandon them to starve and freeze. The mare alone must have cost thousands of dollars when she was young and healthy. Someone had invested in her, bred her, produced these foals, and then something had happened, perhaps financial troubles, perhaps simple cruelty, perhaps a combination of both. Whatever the reason, these horses had been left to die, and they had survived only through the mare's determination and cunning. He thought about how she had traveled through the storm, somehow knowing or sensing where to find help. Had she seen his lights from far away? Had she remembered this place from some past journey, stored in whatever mysterious way horses remember things? Or was it something else entirely, some instinct that Thomas's rational mind couldn't fully grasp? Animals often did things that seemed impossible, demonstrating awareness and intelligence that science struggled to explain. He had read stories of dogs finding their way home across hundreds of miles, of cats who sensed earthquakes hours before they struck, of horses who could detect human illnesses that their riders didn't yet know they had. Perhaps the mare had simply known, in the way that mothers know when their children are in danger, that she needed to find help and find it quickly. Thomas finished his coffee and returned to the living room. The fire had burned down to embers, so he added more wood, building it back up to ensure the room stayed warm through the night. He settled into his old armchair, the one Margaret had always complained was too worn out to keep, but which he had refused to throw away. From here, he could watch over all the horses, monitor their breathing, and be ready to act if any of them showed signs of distress. Winston came and lay down beside the chair, and Thomas reached down to scratch behind the old dog's ears. "What a night, Winston," he murmured. "What a strange, impossible night." The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor in response. Every 2 hours throughout that long night, Thomas got up and prepared another bottle of formula for the white foal. Each time, the process was the same. He would gently lift the little one's head, offer the nipple, and coax it to drink. Each time, the foal managed to take a bit more than the time before. By the fourth feeding, around 6 in the morning, the white foal's eyes stayed open longer, and it even tried to lift its head on its own. The improvement was subtle but unmistakable. This tiny creature was fighting its way back to life with every ounce of strength it possessed. The 3 gray foals also improved as the night wore on. Their breathing became stronger and more regular, and their body temperature rose to normal levels. By dawn, they were able to stand on shaky legs and take a few tentative steps around the living room, exploring their strange new environment with growing curiosity. One of them, the smallest of the 3 with a distinctive black mane, discovered Winston and spent several minutes carefully sniffing the old dog from nose to tail. Winston bore this examination with patient dignity, only moving when the foal got too enthusiastic with its nosing and nearly knocked him over. The mare had dozed fitfully throughout the night, waking at every sound, every movement of her foals. But she had allowed herself to rest, trusting Thomas in a way that still amazed him. At dawn, when the first gray light began filtering through the windows, she rose to her feet and shook herself, her mane rippling like water. Thomas had prepared a large bucket of the grain mash for her, along with plenty of water, and he set these down in front of her. The mare hesitated only a moment before lowering her massive head and eating. She was hungry, desperately so, but she ate slowly and carefully, her instincts telling her not to gorge herself too quickly after prolonged starvation. Thomas watched her eat and found himself speaking to her as naturally as he would to another person. "You saved them, you know. All 4 of them. You're the strongest, bravest mother I've ever seen." The mare paused in her eating and turned her head to look at him, and for a moment, their eyes met in a gaze of perfect understanding. Then she returned to her food, but Thomas could have sworn he saw something like pride in her expression. She had done what she set out to do. She had found help for her babies, and they were safe now, all of them, even the fragile white one who had been so close to death. As morning brightened, the storm outside began to show signs of weakening. The howling wind dropped to a steady blow, and the snow, while still falling, no longer came in blinding horizontal sheets. Thomas could see his barn again, and beyond it, the fence line of his property. The world was buried under feet of new snow, transformed into an alien landscape of white drifts and frozen sculptures. It would take days for the county to clear the roads, days before he could get these horses to a veterinarian for proper examination and care, but he had enough supplies to keep them fed and warm, and that was what mattered. They had survived the worst of it. Now it was just a matter of helping them recover. Thomas called his daughter Sarah around 8 in the morning once he thought she would be awake. She lived 3 hours away in the city, far enough that she couldn't come help even if the roads were clear, but he needed to tell someone about what had happened. "Sarah, you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you," he began, and then he launched into the whole incredible story. Sarah listened in growing astonishment, interrupting occasionally with questions or exclamations. "Dad, that's amazing," she said when he finished. "But where did they come from? Who do they belong to?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I'm going to find out. As soon as the roads are clear, I'll start making calls. Someone must be looking for them." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said softly, "What if no one is looking for them, Dad? What if whoever owned them wanted them gone?" Thomas had been thinking the same thing, had been dreading that possibility. If no one claimed these horses, if they had been deliberately abandoned, then what? He couldn't keep them. His small farm wasn't set up for horses, especially not a giant mare and 4 foals. But he also couldn't imagine turning them over to just anyone, not after what they had been through. "Let's cross that bridge when we come to it," he told Sarah, though he knew the bridge was already looming in front of him. "For now, I just need to focus on getting them healthy." Sarah made him promise to call her every day with updates and to take pictures if he could. She wanted to see these miraculous horses for herself, even if only through photos. After he hung up, Thomas did take some pictures with his old phone, though they hardly did justice to the sight. How could a photograph capture the size of the mare, the fragility of the white foal, the bond of trust that had formed in a single night between a lonely farmer and a family of desperate horses? The days that followed established a new rhythm in Thomas's life. He had become a full-time caretaker for 5 horses, and his entire existence revolved around their needs. Every 2 hours during the day, he fed the white foal with the bottle, and every 4 hours at night, setting an alarm to wake himself. The little one, whom Thomas had started calling Ghost because of its pure white coat and how close it had come to slipping away into death, grew stronger with each feeding. By the 3rd day, Ghost could stand on its own for several minutes at a time, and by the 5th day, it was taking wobbly steps around the living room, following Thomas with devoted attention. The 3 gray foals, whom Thomas had named Storm, Shadow, and Star, based on their distinctive markings, recovered even more quickly. Within a week, they were energetic and playful, racing around the living room and investigating everything with typical foal curiosity. They got into everything, knocking over lamps, chewing on the edges of furniture, and generally creating chaos. Thomas should have been annoyed, but instead, he found himself laughing more than he had in years. The house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since Margaret died. The silence that had pressed down on him for so long had been replaced by the sounds of life, whinnies and hoofbeats, and the constant motion of young creatures discovering their world. The mare, whom Thomas called Lady, because of her regal bearing and gentle nature, blossomed under consistent food and care. Her ribs no longer showed through her coat, and her muscles began to fill out, revealing the magnificent creature she had been before starvation had wasted her. She was enormous when healthy, easily the largest horse Thomas had ever been near, with a presence that was both powerful and serene. Lady followed Thomas everywhere he went in the house, her massive hooves somehow never stepping on anything important, her huge body navigating the rooms with surprising grace. She trusted him completely now, allowing him to handle her foals, check their health, and even trim their tiny hooves when they grew too long. On the 8th day after the blizzard, the county finally cleared the main roads. Thomas immediately called the local veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 50s who had been treating his cattle for years. When he told her about the horses, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You have 4 foals and a draft mare living in your house," she repeated, her tone suggesting she thought he might have lost his mind. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, "and they need to be checked out properly. I've done what I can, but I need a professional opinion." Dr. Morrison promised to come out the next day, weather permitting, and true to her word, her truck appeared in Thomas's driveway right at 9 in the morning. The veterinarian's eyes went wide when she walked into Thomas's living room and saw the horses. "Good Lord," she breathed. "You weren't exaggerating. That mare is massive. And you say they just showed up in the blizzard?" Thomas nodded and told her the whole story while she examined each horse carefully. She spent extra time with Ghost, listening to the tiny foal's heart and lungs, checking its temperature and reflexes. "This little one was very close to death," she said finally. "Another few hours, and it wouldn't have made it. You saved its life, Thomas. You saved all their lives." Dr. Morrison examined Lady last, running her hands over the mare's body, checking her teeth, her eyes, her overall condition. She found something that made her pause, a brand mark on Lady's left shoulder, partially obscured by her thick winter coat. "Thomas," she called, and he came over to look. "This is a registered brand. This mare belongs to someone, or belonged to someone. We can trace this." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had known this moment would come, but he still wasn't ready for it. Part of him had started to hope that no one would claim them, that somehow these horses could just stay with him, but that was selfish, and he knew it. Dr. Morrison took pictures of the brand and promised to run it through the registry database. Within 2 days, she called back with information. The brand belonged to a farm about 40 miles away, a place called Riverside Meadows that had been in operation for over 30 years. "But here's the thing, Thomas," Dr. Morrison said. Her voice troubled. "I called them. And the owner, a man named Richard Dalton, said he sold all his horses 6 months ago when he fell on hard times. He claims he doesn't own any horses anymore, and hasn't for half a year." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. "So he abandoned them," he said flatly. "Sold his property, sold whatever he could, and just left these horses to starve." Dr. Morrison sighed. "I don't know all the details, but it looks that way. The property was foreclosed on, and from what I gather, Dalton just walked away from everything, including any animals that were left. It happens more than you'd think, especially in tough economic times. People lose their farms, and sometimes they just can't face dealing with the animals. It's not right, but it happens." "What does this mean legally?" Thomas asked. "Who owns them now?" Dr. Morrison explained that since Dalton had abandoned the animals and the property had been foreclosed, ownership was murky. The bank might technically own them as part of the estate, or they might be considered abandoned property. Either way, no one was going to come looking for them. If Thomas wanted to keep them, he probably could, though there might be some paperwork involved. The veterinarian paused before adding, "But, Thomas, you need to think about this carefully. That's 5 horses. Do you have any idea what it costs to feed and care for 5 horses, especially with one that size? And you'd need proper facilities. Your barn isn't set up for horses." Thomas knew she was right. His small barn had 4 stalls for his cattle, a tack room, and a hayloft. There was no proper fencing for horses, no pasture management, none of the infrastructure needed for equine care. Keeping these horses would mean major changes to his property and his life. It would mean significant expense at a time when he was living on a fixed retirement income. It would mean hard physical work every single day, work that was challenging even for someone half his age. The sensible thing would be to contact a horse rescue, let them take the horses and find them new homes. Lady was magnificent when healthy. She would find a good placement easily. And the foals, especially the unique white one, would be adopted quickly. But even as Thomas thought these practical thoughts, he looked at Lady standing in his living room, at Ghost sleeping peacefully by the fire, at the 3 gray foals playing with Winston, and he knew he couldn't do it. These horses had chosen him. Lady had traveled through a killer blizzard to bring her babies to his door, trusting him with their lives. Ghost had fought back from the edge of death in his bathtub, fed from bottles he had prepared with his own hands. How could he just hand them over to strangers now? "I'll figure it out," he told Dr. Morrison. "I'll make it work somehow." Over the next few weeks, Thomas did exactly that. He called in favors from neighbors, hired local contractors, and poured his savings into transforming his property. The barn was expanded and modified, new stalls built specifically for horses with proper gates and ventilation. Fencing was installed around his back pasture, strong enough to contain horses but spaced appropriately so they wouldn't injure themselves. He converted one section of his property into a proper paddock where the horses could exercise and play. It was expensive and exhausting, but Thomas threw himself into the work with an energy he hadn't felt in years. His daughter Sarah came to visit as soon as the weather improved, bringing her 2 teenage children with her. They fell in love with the horses instantly, especially Ghost, who by now had recovered enough to be playful and affectionate. Sarah's son Jacob spent hours in the pasture with the foals, and her daughter Emma brushed Lady's mane until it shone like silver silk. As Sarah watched her father with the horses, she saw something she hadn't seen in years. He was happy, truly deeply happy in a way he hadn't been since her mother died. The horses had given him purpose again, a reason to get up every morning, something to care for beyond his own solitary existence. One afternoon, while Sarah helped her father move hay bales into the new barn, she asked the question that had been on her mind since her first visit. "Dad, why do you think they came here? Out of all the farms in the county, all the houses they could have gone to, why yours?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, stacking hay with methodical precision. Finally, he said, "I've thought about that a lot, and I think maybe they needed me as much as I needed them. I was alone, Sarah. After your mother died, I was just going through the motions, waiting to join her. But these horses, they gave me something to live for again. Maybe Lady sensed that somehow. Maybe she knew I would understand what it meant to be desperate and alone." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes and hugged her father tightly. "I'm glad they found you, Dad. I'm so glad." As winter gave way to spring, the horses thrived. Lady regained her full strength and magnificence, standing in the pasture like a monument to survival and maternal devotion. The 3 gray foals grew rapidly, their personalities emerging distinct and delightful. Storm was bold and adventurous, always the first to investigate anything new. Shadow was gentle and thoughtful, often standing quietly beside Thomas while he worked. Star was mischievous and clever, constantly finding ways to open gates or steal treats from pockets. But it was Ghost who captured everyone's heart. The tiny white foal who had been so close to death grew into a stunning young horse, still smaller than its siblings, but with a presence that was almost ethereal. Its coat remained pure white, unmarked by any spots or shading, and its dark eyes held an intelligence and awareness that seemed almost human. Ghost followed Thomas everywhere, nickering softly when he appeared, pressing its soft nose into his hand, seeking affection. The bond between them was profound and obvious to everyone who saw it. One warm April morning, Thomas sat on his porch with his coffee, watching the 5 horses graze peacefully in the pasture. Winston lay at his feet, the old dog content in the sunshine. The grass had come back green and lush after the brutal winter, and the horses moved through it with obvious pleasure, Lady's massive form dwarfing her growing foals. Thomas marveled at how different everything looked now compared to that terrible night in January. The snow was gone, replaced by wildflowers and new growth. The horses that had arrived at his door half dead were now healthy and vibrant, full of life and energy. And Thomas himself felt transformed, younger somehow despite his years, energized by purpose and the daily demands of caring for his unexpected family. Dr. Morrison stopped by that morning for a routine check on the horses. She had become a regular visitor, partly for professional reasons and partly because she had grown attached to the remarkable animals she had helped save. As she examined each horse, taking notes and nodding with satisfaction at their progress, she kept glancing at Thomas with a peculiar expression. Finally, as she was packing up her equipment, she said, "Thomas, I need to tell you something. I did some more research into Riverside Meadows and Richard Dalton." He paused in his coffee drinking and looked at her expectantly. Lady's full registered name was Dalton's Lady Grace, Dr. Morrison continued. She was Richard's foundation mare, the horse he built his entire breeding program around. She won ribbons at shows, produced exceptional foals, and by all accounts was his pride and joy. Thomas felt his chest tighten. "So what happened?" he asked quietly. "Why did he abandon her?" The veterinarian sat down on the porch steps with a sigh. "From what I pieced together, Richard's wife died 2 years ago. Cancer. After that, he fell into a deep depression. The farm started failing because he couldn't manage it alone. He got behind on payments, started selling off horses, but he kept Lady. She was the last one he had, the one he couldn't bear to part with." Dr. Morrison looked out at the pasture where Lady grazed with her foals. But when the foreclosure notice came, something in him just broke. He couldn't face watching strangers take over his farm, couldn't stand the thought of Lady being sold at auction. So he opened all the gates one night and drove away. He told himself the horses would be better off wild than at auction, that they would find food and shelter somehow. It was cowardice dressed up as mercy. Thomas felt his anger from before returning, but it was tempered now with something else, something that might have been understanding or at least recognition of human weakness. "There's more," Dr. Morrison said. "I tracked Richard down. He's living with his sister in Montana now, working odd jobs, trying to rebuild his life. When I told him about Lady and the Foals, about how they survived and found you, he broke down on the phone. He asked me to tell you something." She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Thomas. "He wrote this for you." Thomas unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, written by someone in deep emotional distress. The letter read, "Mr. Brennan, I don't deserve your forgiveness and I'm not asking for it. What I did to Lady and her babies was unforgivable. I was broken and cowardly, and they paid the price for my weakness. But I want you to know that Lady is the smartest, bravest horse I've ever known. When she was young, before my wife got sick, we used to take her on long rides through the county. We rode past your farm many times. Your wife would sometimes come out and admire Lady, give her apples from your trees. Lady remembered kindness. She always did. I think that's why she went to you that night. She remembered your farm as a place of safety and kindness. Please take care of her and her babies. They deserve so much better than what I gave them. Thank you for being the man I should have been. Richard Dalton." Thomas read the letter twice, his vision blurring with tears. He remembered those encounters now, vaguely, from years ago. A couple would ride by on occasion, the woman on a magnificent gray mare, and Margaret would call out compliments and sometimes bring treats for the horses. He had forgotten those moments, lost in the fog of grief after Margaret's death. But Lady hadn't forgotten. Through starvation and cold, through the confusion and terror of abandonment, through everything she had remembered, and when she needed help desperately, when her babies were dying, she had made her way through a blizzard to the one place she remembered as safe. Thomas folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He looked out at Lady, who had lifted her head and was looking back at him as if she knew they were talking about her. "She's an extraordinary horse," he said to Dr. Morrison. "They all are, but she's something special." The veterinarian nodded. "You know, in all my years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like this. The odds against their survival were astronomical. The fact that Lady found your farm in that storm, that you were home and heard them, that you had the supplies and knowledge to save them, especially Ghost. It's like every impossible thing had to align perfectly, and somehow it did. Thomas thought about that word, miracle, and decided it fit. This whole experience had been miraculous from start to finish. 5 horses had appeared at his door in the middle of the worst blizzard in decades, led by a mare who remembered kindness from years past. A tiny white foal had been pulled back from death itself. A lonely old man had found purpose and joy again. None of it should have worked, but all of it had. As spring deepened into summer, Thomas's farm became something of a local legend. People would drive by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the giant mare and her 4 foals, especially the pure white one that had survived against all odds. Thomas didn't mind the attention. He would wave at the gawkers, and sometimes, if they stopped to ask, he would tell them the story. Not to boast, but to share the wonder of it, to remind people that impossible things sometimes happen, that animals are capable of remarkable intelligence and devotion, and that even in our darkest moments, salvation can arrive if we're willing to answer the door.